So far during the Lenten season, we've been pairing readings from the Gospel of John so that there'll be a reading of the day and then there'll be another reading to which I will be referencing in the sermon, because there is some kinship, some overflow, if you will, in the two narratives that might help us better understand the narrative of today and the one that we are referencing. The story that we read today is really a good story. It's to the point. It's one of the times when John gets to the point without so much double entendre and theologizing. But I want to link that up with the story of a man, a paralytic, whom Jesus found near the sheep's gate at the pool at Bethsaida. In both today's story and the healing at Bethsaida, two people were cured, but the circumstances were totally different. The second story finds a person, a local boy, if you will, who was lain by this pool, chronically ill for 38 years. Can't even ponder that. 38 years, daily, hoping, praying, wondering, body broken. As we've mentioned before, what goes along with that for many people in the Scriptures is that there is a sense of deep shame and guilt, because when you have brokenness of body, and we probably are going to be visiting this next week, that Deuteronomic theology says you must have done something to deserve it. He would wait there by the waters, waiting for the waters to be troubled. And the tradition had it that the first one that was into those troubled waters when they were troubled would receive healing. 38 years waiting there. I oftentimes wonder how many close calls he must have had in order to stick with it. Jesus walks up to the man and says, "Well, do you want to be healed?" Which seems as a question so cruel in some ways. But Jesus was asking a much larger question. In today's story, the person that approaches Jesus is an official, probably Roman, some Roman bureaucrat, no doubt. Definitely not a person of Jesus' faith tradition. He was a member of an occupying force, which means he was beloved by nobody across the land. His son was dying, and he heard of Jesus, and he came desperate, no doubt. How many of us would go to any extreme that we could to advocate on behalf of our child? And the official hears Jesus say, "Well, you won't have faith unless you see miracles and wonders." But the man, he wasn't put off. He didn't pause. He was desperate. He was willing to beg for his child. Jesus gave him the words that he longed to hear. "Your son will live. Go home to him." I wonder how I would be in that moment. I would kind of sit there in disbelief saying, "Are you sure? Is this something I can really trust?" John says he just heard what Jesus said and left and went home. And of course, as you just heard the story, on the way home, he runs into a servant who gives him the good news. And so then John goes out of the way to let us know what the time is. Now, in Jesus' day, they didn't have any mix-up between daylight savings time and standard time. So they wanted to make sure what the clock said, and says, oh, it took place at exactly this time. And the man then knew in his heart the reason for the healing. It was a confirmation of this being about Jesus and what Jesus had done. In both stories, the curing take place immediately. Though the official, of course, as I just said, had no way of knowing that information at the time. There was in this text no mixing of mud. We're going to run into that in John probably next week too. There were no incantations, no fancy prayer cloth sold for a minimum contribution of $25. Jesus simply used imperatives in both cases. He said to the official, go. That's what he said. He said to the paralytic, he used 3 different imperatives. Stand up, take your mat, and walk. Both of these desperate people did what Jesus asked them to do. You see, the signs Jesus does is found in the book of John. This has been pointed out by scholars much better than myself. They aren't done to evoke belief for their own sake. Rather, Jesus is not simply a wonder worker. No, Jesus was something else. And so what we see and experience in Jesus is what John had already testified about Jesus early at the very beginning of the gospel. For John is saying that Jesus is God's Word made flesh, the very embodiment of God among humanity, the people of Israel. You see, Jesus was, to the people of his day, the Ark of the Covenant. And through this Jesus, we are empowered, John wants us to know, to become children of God. That's what Jesus is up to, according to John. And so when Jesus asked the paralytic, well, do you want to be made well? He isn't asking, do you want to get better or not? He's asking a bigger question than that. We're told that the official, when Jesus talked to him and he was told to go, he was so moved by his son's healing that he himself believed, along with his whole household. There was a shift in both of these people, a shift beyond just the physical restoration, you understand. As modern people, well, we get kind of tarnished about curing. We see folk cured all the time. At least the symptoms of their disease get somewhat mitigated. We may be overpowered on some days by the power of medical science. We may be overwhelmed by all that we see. But we're no longer shocked. Things truly amazing can be accomplished by people with medical training and staffs that are well trained and proper facilities and equipment. Seeing people cured, again, doesn't shock us much. Evangelists dating back to, remember Oral Roberts? They've been around preaching, smacking people on the heads. If you've never seen Ernest Ainsley, that's something to see. You know, smack you on the head. All kinds of people who have been bringing about healing and curing from their perspective. And then if you're looking at alternative paths of medicine, there are the herbalists, there are the osteopaths, the acupuncturists. In some places, you can even go buy a voodoo potion to cure someone. There are always alternative paths to getting cured. As I've said before, I was known to have cured a radio in a Ford Taurus station wagon years ago at the halfway house that I was vice chair of the board at. But, and it's a gigantic but here, folks. The question or questions is or are for they or you or we. Are we on the way to being healed? Are we on the way to being made whole? Is our brokenness finally getting addressed? There is so much pain we carry around with us. So much. I can't believe, I was pondering this with Chris the other night, how much pain people carry around that comes with them through their lives and impact the family in which they live. And how so many of them are able to deal with that so differently. I was reading Gloria's obituary. You know, that her mom left the family and she had this crew of siblings. And she took over and raised those kids as a surrogate mom in early adolescence. And Gloria was tough, but she was wonderful. She dealt with that adversity and found a way through to have healing along the way. And yet I know of other people who run into bumps in their early life and they fall to pieces and they become almost just bitter in everything that they do. The question is, do we want to be healed, and what does that look like for us? People who struggle all the time with addictions, and I watched this when I was helping to found the Halfway House in Dover, and I was constantly in there to sign checks because the chair of the board was quite ill. And so almost every other day I had to go over to do something administratively. And I would listen to the stories that these guys, because it was for men, they would tell these stories and I was amazed. And then I would watch how they'd worked their program or didn't work their program and how some recovered and some fell away. Some could see no way to be healed and others seemed to open themselves up to this mystery of touch, and their recovery led to such an enriched life as they brought those learnings with them. The stories are not so much about people getting cured. Rather, these are stories of people on the way to being healed, and there is a difference. The next time Jesus meets the paralytic, you know where he meets him? He runs into him in the temple. He has a conversation, ever so brief, with him in the temple. Remember, while he was ill, he would have been damned by those in the temple because they assumed that his sins were the reason for his brokenness. But here he was, no longer broken of body, and he could move into those holy spaces, spaces of grace. And there he met Jesus. And the small, short conversation took place. And he goes off to tell others the good news of what this Jesus has done for him, the difference in his life, the healing that had taken place. The official whose son is brought back from the brink begins a journey of faith and commitment because he has faith, and it says his whole household has faith. John wants us to hear that curing can be a sign of spiritual healing, but in and of itself, it's not healing, for we are left to answer the question that he asked the paralytic. And we're asked to ask ourselves this question daily. Do we want something more than being cured? Do we want that deep shalom that God is willing to provide for us? Because there are people who never become cured in their body, but who find themselves healed in their souls. Always remember a friend of mine, Joyce, she did not receive very positive signals from her family. From the beginning, they were sure to let her know that she should never plan on being married because she wasn't that good looking, and they let her know she wasn't very smart, and they let her know lots of things because, of course, families always know, don't they? She met a guy. He too was broken. He had had many lives, but toward the end of his life, he had a furniture store. They sold furniture, less expensive furniture that people would buy for their places down at Rehoboth Beach or Bethany, places they were going to rent out. Harry was diagnosed with cancer, and shortly thereafter, so was Joyce. Each was undergoing chemotherapy. She was given almost no odds for making it. Harry some. As the treatment went on and got more significant, the sad day came when Joyce, so debilitated by the chemo, had to bury Harry. As it turned out, in this case, medical prognosticators were wrong, and she was cured of body. She took that store. Everybody said she needed to sell it because what did she know about anything anyway? And the next 2 years after Harry's death, they had record profits. You see, Joyce knew more than anybody ever gave her credit for in her family. She had more potential and more gifts, and those bloomed. It was necessary for them to bloom in order for her to find a way forward. And the healing of her soul took place. And ever so often, when I was visiting over there and she would say something about herself, I would say, "So where did you hear that foolishness?" She began to see by the grace of God that there was something more to her than the messages she'd received from her family. She began to believe that there was a place in God's realm for her to bring those gifts. And when she was ready, she brought them into the leadership of the church, onto the board of management, and she shown her financial skills and savvy over and over again. You see, that's more than being cured of body. She would have been glad just to have been cured, to survive, because she had no way of believing that she would. But God gave her something so much more, because God gave her healing, wholeness, shalom. Curing or healing. We use them so interchangeably, but they're really quite different. Curing comes from technology and wisdom and understanding. Healing comes from some place far beyond that, some mystery that we shall never understand. This day, while many of you need to be cured in different ways, as do I pray for you that we will all be healed by the power and grace of God.